All right, everybody, thank you very much for joining. My name is Nathan Jager. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at Echo Store. Want to thank everybody for joining today. We're going to have Paul Wydra, Dave Hanson that are going to be giving the presentation. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. But before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. Feel free to put any questions in the chat. Okay, we'll be trying to make it as interactive as possible and stop these guys along the way when we can to answer your questions. We'll also leave a couple minutes at the end just in case anybody has some last minute questions for a Q&A. We're also going to we are recording this session. We'll be following up with an email with a link to the recording that you can share with your teams if you found this pretty valuable, which I imagine you will. Additionally, as I'm sure you saw, we're going to raffle off a couple sets of AirPod Pros at the end of the session. Just to thank you all for joining. We know you're using your lunch break for this, so appreciate everybody joining. So stay tuned for that at the end. You will need to still be on the webinar at the end, just so that we can use the names to run the raffle. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dave Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nate. So we'll be covering asset management, really everything that surrounds it, and then sort of how ServiceNow fits into the ecosystem. But the housekeeping item that we need to take care of is Kahoot. So if you have a cell phone, you can't really see it here, but because of the virtual background, but we'll be using Kahoot. Paul will be asking some questions at the beginning and at the end. Super easy to use. If anyone has any issues using it, just throw a chat in there, but go to kahoot.it, or you can actually download the app, not necessary, but that's what we'll be using to do some of the trivia during the course of this presentation.
And Paul, will you be giving out the game pin as we get closer?
Correct. Yeah, we just want to give you the heads up to get your phones ready, and you'll get the pin in just a few minutes.
Okay.
So the long story short, my name is Dave Hanson. I am on the ServiceNow team here. I've been in the ecosystem since 2012. Paul Wydra, who's the more important person on this call, has been in the ecosystem as well for that long. He is a certified master architect. So ServiceNow has only designated less than 100 of these individuals as certified master architects. The real sort of secret sauce that goes into what that is the complete solution, right? So there's plenty of folks that are qualified there on a technical basis, and Paul certainly is. But the certified master architect designation is really for completing the solution. So the people and the processes that go into the technology is what Paul's really focused on today. So that's what we'll be talking about with a IT asset management lens. But that is who Paul is at a very high level. Echo Store itself, if you're not familiar with us, we're an award-winning ServiceNow practice. Echo Store has been around for the past 15 years. The ServiceNow practice has been around for the past 5. We really try to bring the complete solution to the table when we go through conversations with our clients, and then really figure out the technology on the back end. So that's why we won all the awards. We're one of the handful of partners that actually has a certified master architect like Paul on staff. And that is who Echo Store is at a high level. So this is the slide where I generally transition into Paul, because he's the guy that knows the whole thing cold. But really excited to be working with the ServiceNow platform for the past 9 years or so, and what it can do for our customers, really focused on outcomes, not necessarily the technology. So all of that being said, that's my little spiel here. I'm going to pass it off to Paul, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Dave. As we're going through today's webinar, also, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to use the Q&A feature. Dave will be checking that and chiming in as questions come about. So please feel free to ask any questions as we go through this. But yes, we really just like to start off by reiterating Echo Store Technologies. We really focus on what's the right solution for our customers. And we continuously look at the ecosystem and understand what is a true service management solution out there, and we continuously really hitch our wagon to the ServiceNow platform. So I know most of you on the call, I'm sure, are ServiceNow customers, or maybe you're considering ServiceNow for asset management. But really at the end of the day, from a best practices standpoint, when we're looking at asset management, other capabilities of what we can do to support really the goal of ITAM, IT asset management, ServiceNow is really the platform of choice for doing so. So for today, in the next 40 minutes or so, 50 minutes, we're really hoping you'll learn and get out of this is, what is asset management? Why is it so important? How can you properly govern your asset management rollout? And where should you start? And what common pitfalls should you look to avoid? What we wanted you to get out of this session is there's plenty of videos out there on ServiceNow's website, on YouTube, for how to demo asset management, what's involved from a feature perspective. But what we noticed is not everyone's talking about how should you approach asset management. What do you need to consider and what do you need to keep in mind? So that's really the focus of today. So before we get started, I do want to just ask a few questions, get an understanding of what everyone is doing today for asset management, what that looks like. So we'll jump over to Kahoot. So if you have your mobile phones ready, we'll go ahead and start this and generate a pin. So if you're at kahoot.it, and if you type in 563-7120, you'll be connected to the game and you'll be asked to type in a nickname. It doesn't have to be your real name. You can make up whatever you want. We're just having some fun here. But if you type in 563-7120, you'll be able to connect. So we'll give it about a minute or so to allow people to connect in. We were on a jazz theme earlier while people were joining. We moved to, I think this is called Adventure. Can't complain. Give it about 15 more seconds. I think one webinar we ran was around Halloween, and there was Halloween themed music. I don't know what it is. I like the Kahoot music. Should make an album. They still make albums? They should. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So if you haven't used Kahoot before, it'll ask you a series of questions on the screen, and then on your device, there's corresponding colors that you can click. So really just want to start off with a poll. You can select multiple choices here. Curious what asset tracking tools are in your environment today? Using SCCM, Jamf, Discovery, something else. Again, you can select multiple options here if you would like.
Hey, Paul, we have a question from Joe asking for the code. So the code is at the bottom, 563-7120.
Correct. Thank you, Dave. Okay, so it looks like we have really a mixed bag here, using SCCM, Jamf, Discovery, some other tools that are out there. What we'll talk about today is part of your asset management strategy may be starting with your assets being populated, or let's understand what's out there today. And some of these are most common connectors into ServiceNow, but that doesn't have to be the only strategy. We can also start with any new devices that are coming in. What is our asset plan? And then sort of populate the devices that way. And then in the later phase, potentially decide, hey, let's populate what we have out there. So you should still be able to connect if you haven't connected yet. And we'll go on to the next question. What best describes your asset management process today? So a single answer for this one. These are more manual or spreadsheets. Maybe you have a point tool out there. Maybe it's a little mixed. Okay, so a little bit of ServiceNow, some mixed, manual, paper, and spreadsheets. Pretty common. I know a lot of times it's if you're using ServiceNow, you might have some aspect of asset management, maybe not fully taking advantage of it yet. Or maybe you're using the catalog to manually track who's asking for what, and then you go over here and you do a paper process or something manual, another tool. And really, we'll look at today a great fit for how do we start with this especially if you're using spreadsheets or you're using ServiceNow, maybe there's something you're not taking advantage of, but really to help streamline the process. Another poll question, multi-select here. Curious, what do you use ServiceNow for today out of these options? Are you leveraging the CMDB, hardware or software asset management, or none of the above? Excellent. Okay, so we do have some CMDB use. That's good. That we could talk for an hour about more on the CMDB and how it's being used. A lot of times may not be to the full potential. I'm sure some of you do have that strategy figured out a bit more, which would be great. But a little mix of kind of a little bit of hardware, a little bit of software. Interesting. Okay, so thank you for using that. You can put your phone to the side. We'll have another question towards the end, but that's it for the questions for now. We'll jump right into the presentation. So when we start thinking about asset management, we'll talk a little bit about what that means, especially what that means to myself, what it means to our customers, because everyone might think a little differently when it comes to asset management. But first, I want to think of what is the importance? Why are we doing this? Why does this matter? And really, we're addressing the problem of not having proper asset management can lead to operational, financial challenges. Most commonly, costs always seem to be going up. There's no control over it. There's no visibility. It's hard to save money or spend less when you don't know what you have out there. You're not sure what you're using, what's being underutilized, and it really, you have trouble planning. Another aspect would be risks with compliance. A lot of times, you've probably heard the term before, shadow IT. So it's very focused on, it might be easier to go around the standard IT asset management process. I'm going to go to my manager. I'm going to use my own corporate card to set up an account over here or buy this device. And that can really cause some problems when it comes to audits and understanding the information you have for audits as well. So there's really a risk around compliance. And there was a recent survey that went out there, and it was about 64% of employees at companies created at least one account that IT didn't know about. And honestly, some companies, I think that's a little bit higher, but always something to keep in mind with that shadow IT and how can we get an understanding of what we have out there. And software asset management will be a big piece of that. If you haven't used it before, heard much about it, but we'll definitely talk about that. Another challenge is the team is overburdened. They're spending too much time on manual processes. They're logging in and using multiple tools, and they just don't have enough time allocated to actually do business priorities. It's more of the keeping the lights on type work. So we want to help alleviate that issue as much as possible. Now, those aside, that's the standard problem that most organizations are facing. I'm sure at least one of those is ringing true with you. But then we had the fun last 12 months or so of working during a pandemic, switching to remote work. And I will put a quarter in the jar for saying the word pandemic, but really a lot of processes had to rapidly change. A lot of companies that we spoke to and that we were helping out over the last 12 months had standard, okay, we send all our devices to the warehouse or our receiving location. Somebody unboxes them, somebody puts an asset tag on them, they configure it, and then it gets delivered to the person's office or somebody picks it up somewhere. A lot of that had to change very quickly. Now we have employees at home. A lot of companies didn't have visibility into what asset do they even have, what's with them, how are we going to set them up for remote work. So I'm sure this is something a lot of you also struggled with a bit today, and even one specific example of How do we transform our process for getting a new laptop out to a new hire or an existing user who's having laptop issues or problems with their cell phone? So a lot of companies had to now ship devices directly to the users. And does that mean sending it to someone in IT, send it to their house, and then they're configuring it there and then resending it, and really can add a lot of complexity. So one of the good things that came out of this is it was a good excuse to consider your process. How can we transform? How can we make this better? And with remote work not going away, that's still a critical aspect of asset management for how do you handle that scenario. With asset management, there should always be a goal in mind. So what's the big idea here? A typical goal that's desired is simplifying end-to-end IT lifecycle management to enable more informed IT investment decisions, and also while eliminating double work. This always is very relevant with our customers, this concept of double work, and it always seems to ring true with asset management. I'm going in this system over here. Maybe I received an order maybe someone sent me an email to say I need a new laptop, maybe using ServiceNow's catalog to have that request. But then it's the process of I need to go to our ERP system. I need to go to the CDW's website and place the order. It's a lot of multiple systems, sort of double work. How can we streamline that? A lot of what we're hearing for why now is not a good time to do asset management, like, oh, it's a great idea, but we really can't do it. It's usually around our process today is very complex. We have an ingrained process, and maybe it's not that streamlined, but everybody uses it. Maybe the culture is not open to change. Or a huge piece is always time for my team to dedicate in making this change or standing up a new system and being involved in that project. So one item you'll get out of today is how we can essentially get around some of these issues for why not get started now. How can we best get started? And how to be successful with that is starting with a foundation. How can we get quick wins? How can we understand what's important, what's critical, what's a priority, what makes the most sense to begin with, and then grow from there with what we like to call practical process transformation. So it's not coming in and doing a 3-year engagement on this is how we need to change everything. We're ripping everything out and we're doing it all in sort of a big bang approach. It's those quick wins, those little pieces that we're slowly making the transformation. We have a plan in place for how to handle the culture changes that are involved, but following the best practices that the ServiceNow platform offers for here's how you should approach IT asset management. What success usually looks like and some typical outcomes that come out of an IT asset management engagement. First and foremost, improved auditability. So visibility, reporting, we seem to always have a need for addressing something that comes up in an audit. Hopefully it's being proactive and knowing that, hey, we need to be prepared for future audits. But of course, it's usually more of a reactive, hey, we failed an audit, we had a problem. We need to make sure we understand what we have out there. So that's definitely an outcome for what we're looking to get out of asset management. Another one is just streamlining the approach. So we talked about that double work before. Streamline the process, and out of it, you'll get better reporting, better metrics, that unified workflow, and of course, again, that visibility. And with this, you're simplifying the environment, reducing those manual efforts. If there's legacy tools out there, having a plan in place for how to attack those, how can we replace them? How do we work with the ones that can't go anywhere right now? But taking advantage of purpose-built asset management workflows, whether it be hardware, whether it be software. So just to sort of level set for what we mean by asset management, because again, depending on who you talk to, might be a little different. Really a resource or a capability, something that can contribute to the delivery of a service. A lot of times it's hardware devices, software licenses, software packages. It could be buildings, consumables like keyboards and mice, items that you don't necessarily put an asset tag on, but you need to be able to track. Equipment in data centers. I had one client in the past who their marketing department used ServiceNow's asset management to track pens they had for all the swag that they had. So it's pens and fidget spinners, oh my. But really it's assets, anything that makes sense to track. And sometimes it's kind of is that fine balance of, is it more overhead than it's worth to track a certain item? That's what goes into the decision of what types of assets make sense, especially from your approach perspective. What makes sense now from a crawl aspect? What makes sense maybe later in the walk, later in the run? And we'll talk about that. A fun conversation I always have is, are we talking asset or are we talking CI, configuration items? If you haven't heard this comparison before, when we think asset management, it's really that larger umbrella. And then under it, you have sort of the financial aspect, which is really asset. And then you have the more operational view, which is configuration item. And you can think about it as two sides of the same coin. And really what that looks like from a process side is, in your asset management process, you have, how do we start the process? If someone were requesting this, how do we know we need to order items? Then we actually go through and procure it, and then we receive it. And then once it's in stock is really where you have that connection to more the operational side, the CIs in your CMDB. And then once it's no longer in stock, whether it be retired, it's broken, whatever that process is, and you go through disposal, that's back in the asset management process. So if you're one who gets a little confused by CI or asset, or especially in ServiceNow world, what does that mean? Hopefully that helps clear that up a bit. So today we're going to really focus on the asset side and sort of the true tracking of the devices of the assets that you have. But of course, knowing it is absolutely connected to CMDB, it's connected to how do we handle this from an operational standpoint. Usually can't have one without the other. So when we think about, you want to approach asset management, how do we ensure that we're going to have a successful rollout? It really requires three main items. You could think about it as the three legs of a stool. One is organizational change management. This is key and tends to be forgotten as part of a lot of projects. You can build the greatest tool out there, but if nobody uses it, it's really not doing you any good. So how are we going to handle the culture? How are we going to handle the changes that need to come with a project like this? So it's very critical that you have that as part of your approach, as part of your engagement. And we'll talk about some things to look out for, some things to consider if you're doing this internally, if you're working with a partner like EchoStore, if you're working with someone else. These are the questions that you want to ask. Program governance. How do you govern yourself in terms of the actual rollout, the actual engagement? It needs to be more than just the technology. You can't be turning the knobs and the switches and that's all that's planned for. It's how do we handle the transition? Not just the culture change, but training, collateral that comes with it, being able to manage the project effectively. And really having maximized technology. The tool itself, ServiceNow, the technology, it's not the only piece, but it really needs to be part of the plan for how do we get the most out of this? Are we using the tool correctly? And that's where the best practices come into play. Keeping those customizations to a minimum and knowing that, hey, if there's a small improvement we can make in our process, let's make sure that we're leveraging it to the best of our ability without changing how ServiceNow approached that best practice. When we think about a successful engagement, I'm also always asked, well, who needs to be involved? What are some key roles for your asset process? This varies organization by organization, but what we want to keep in mind is you definitely need a process owner. You need someone who's sort of a asset manager, kind of managing the process, talking back to the actual owner itself, because the owner is responsible for the overall success, the overall mission, and the manager is more doing the day-to-day activities and working with the asset owners who the individuals responsible for these assets. So the asset manager helps kind of control the process, but the asset owner is the one who needs to make sure that oh, yes, this is up to date, or, we're not using this anymore, it's being retired. What does that procedure looks like? And then the stakeholders involved is anyone who has interest in this process. They need to get reports. They need to get details or metrics. So a lot of times it's a business unit lead, senior manager, or a team lead. How this usually falls from a hierarchy standpoint, again, differs organization by organization, but usually you have the asset owner you might have one for hardware, you might have one for software. Sometimes it's the same individual wearing multiple hats. Larger companies tend to have it broken out a little bit more, where you have asset owners for desktops, servers, mobile devices. Your organization might be a hybrid of the two. That's what we generally find. A lot of times it's, we have someone who's kind of in charge of hardware, but we also have someone who's your end user devices, and then your data center devices, your more servers. But what we find is usually missing is sort of this middle layer. Hopefully a process owner is involved, but having someone who's kind of managing all hardware, all software is definitely a best practice approach that you want to consider if you're not doing that today. Now, things to keep in mind for making decisions as part of your governance process, as part of these folks involved, making sure your project is successful. It's really about 8 different items that you'll see here, but they're very specific for, you don't want to lose sight of the goal. So when you think back to what's the big idea, why are we doing this? Make sure that we're staying focused on that. And especially from a phase perspective, there may be the higher level, this is where we want to get to, but this is what we're doing right now or in the next 6 months. Don't lose sight of that goal. You, of course, want to examine the benefits of what are the costs by maintaining this. This goes back to the type of assets you're tracking, the type of data. Is it more work to handle it than it's worth what you get out of it? Definitely something you want to consider. And you want to follow the 80-20 rule. I love this rule. Plan for the 80% of what happens, and don't let the 20% get in the way of defining your process. This is where companies tend to struggle the most. We get very caught up on one-off use cases or very specific tasks that may not be a good fit for day one. You want to focus on, let's get that foundation in place, that standard. That's going to be your 80%. And then the 20% could be for future enhancements. Maybe right now there needs to be a process in between the two that's outside of ServiceNow. These are all decisions that need to be made, but focus on that 80%. And that's key to being successful for your initial asset rollout, or as you want to improve your asset rollout, keeping that in mind. And then what's really nice is doing this in ServiceNow, we can leverage, really, if you internally handle sort of an agile process, or if you've worked with EchoStore before, we have a best practice hybrid approach of waterfall and agile, but really we're able to essentially prototype. Here's how this is going to work. Here's how this is going to be built out. It's a very transparent process, and you can catch things, work through feedback, and really work through the process. Some other internal decision-making guidelines you also want to consider is security. So consider what assets are we tracking and who needs access to that. There may be more sensitive assets that you need to keep in mind. Change management, not in terms of IT change management, but in terms of how do we make a decision? What happens in the project if something's changed, priorities have shifted? How do we handle that? How do we escalate? Making sure that that's always kept in mind. And not introducing changes that are non-essential. This ties really closely back to the 80-20 rule. Don't get hung up on those one-off use cases. Don't get hung up on something that's very complex and doesn't make sense as a good fit for day one. Focus on more quick wins, what can be achieved in a reasonable timeline and within reason. And we'll have a little bit more on what that means, because it usually ties to organizational change as part of that. Standardize, standardize, standardize. Any exceptions to the process should go through an approval process. Why does this need to be this way? what should we be focusing on for the standards? And I'll have another slide on this, or we'll talk to it. But when you come up with standards for not only your process, but also things like where to start with assets. If your organization has 30 different laptops out there, yeah, you may want to track those, but from a day one perspective, and if you're defining what are our asset models, meaning what's a standard that we have and that we deploy and that we use, most companies, maybe it's two different types. Maybe I have the Dell laptop and the Lenovo laptop that is kind of the standard that we order now. And some people can get the Mac. If Mac is less than 5% of users, don't start with that. Focus on what the 80-20 rule. What are most of the devices that we're seeing, that we're using? That's what you want to start with. I mentioned it earlier, one of the stools, or one of the legs of the stool, I should say, organizational change. The success depends on the adoption of this. And here at EchoStore, we have a proven approach to this. And we'll give you some tips and tricks here today. But really, it's planning, execution is key to the adoption. A lot of times, it may be one of these, the planning or the execution, that gets focused on, but both are truly important. And the important aspects of those are really in the beginning of this process, the preparing and the researching that we'll kind of focus on today. But of course, you're going to need documentation. How do we execute? How do we enable ongoing OCM, organizational change management? Because it's not a one and done. It's a program that rolls out as part of what we're rolling out asset management. But how are we going to handle changes in the future? What comes next? How do we stay involved? But sort of back to the theme of where to begin, or where's a good place to start. Step one is building out a team of, here's our OCM team. One person might wear multiple hats in this case, but it's key to have at least these 4 areas covered. Who's going to handle communication to the organization, or the organization of that? Who's going to handle the enablement process? Really, who's our champion for this? Who's our technical liaison? Again, one person might wear multiple hats, but it's key to have these types of areas defined. Make sure leadership is on board with the organizational change. So a lot of times there's conversations that need to take place beforehand, getting leadership on board. If you need help with that, that is something that EchoStore we do very frequently, especially now as a certified master architect with ServiceNow. I've been doing this more and more, but really talking to leaders and understanding why this is important, a lot of the research that went into this, and defining what is success going to look like. It's key to always tie things back to the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And this is a great first step for organizational change. And then really the second step is where this starts to come together. So when we're thinking about asset management, learn who's going to be involved and who's going to be impacted. And this is a great way to sort of map this out. The level of influence of that individual, of that group, and the level of impact or the interest. And so you want to make sure a high level of influence, but maybe a low level of impact. You want to engage them and involve them. But if it's high impact, high influence, we definitely want to partner with that individual, with that group, to make sure that they're on board. We can understand and work with them directly. This is a step, or a piece, I should say, that tends to be forgotten, but is really important. Assess for readiness and resistance. A lot of where you should start with your asset management process could be based on how open to change are they. It's not always that easy. Sometimes there's the conversation of, well, this group, they're a little bit more resistant to change, but we're losing a lot of money with this current process. That needs to be fixed. That needs to be the priority. But on the other side of it, if you're looking for quick wins and where should we start, a lot of times that low-hanging fruit is people who are really on board. They're ready for this. They're a group that knows how to do change well. And with other companies in the past, when we're working with them through their organizational change plan, a lot of times they have a group in mind of, we always work with this group. They're very excited to work with us. They like the new change that's coming, and that's a great pilot group to work with. Evaluate the risks. So back to the prioritization. What's the risk of doing this change? What's the risk of not doing this change? And sometimes the low-hanging fruit might not be the way to go. It needs to be, well, it's really risky if we don't change that current process that's a little bit more complex. So we need to prioritize that. But again, anytime you can do a quick win, anytime you can do starting with those teams that are really on board, it definitely is a different type of engagement in that sense. So I do think it's important to touch on organizational change. I hear a lot of people talk about it or say, hey, you need it, but they don't actually tell you what you need to do or how to consider it. So I hope that is helpful. But now, how do we actually start on the asset management journey? And this doesn't have to mean start because this is only relevant for people who haven't done anything with asset. A lot of times this could be a restart. This could be, yeah, we're using it, but not really taking advantage of it today. We might have some concerns. So this approach will work for whatever side you may be sitting in. Usually what we see as the holdup or reasons for not moving forward is, we have so much data out there that we'll have to retire this other system and import it in. That's going to take months, if not years. The process transformation side, whether it be specifics are needed in the process that might not align well, or again, back to organizational change for that group who's doing that process. Maybe there's tons of systems we'll have to integrate with. Really, you can still start small or with that certain team. And you always want to think about what's your crawl solution. You'll see an example of what we've seen before, what we've helped clients with in more of a crawl, walk, run capacity. But legacy data and other systems, there may be a spot in your process where, we don't want to touch that. We're going to handle 70% of it over here in ServiceNow, but maybe someone needs to swivel chair, go to this other system, for day one. It's a huge step above where we are. And that's okay. It's really those quick wins and how can we start this journey and what comes next and what's the planning that should go into this. Don't be afraid to start somewhere if you're stuck in a legacy environment or very complex processes. This is a conversation we're involved with very frequently. Some quick tips for how to begin. If you don't already have those standards defined for asset models, meaning the laptops, the devices, the cell phones that are always given out, start there. Can you standardize that without too much pushback from the rest of the business? That may be, okay, now we start with a specific group because they always have these two devices. And there's always that balance of how to do that. But there should at least be, these are the standards that we are going with now moving forward. Don't get hung up on what's out there today or, tracking that. That can be part of the project. That could be the next phase. But start with moving forward. This is what the standard should be. And if you have those key roles involved in this process and part of organizational change, you will find this to go better than if you don't. If you start introducing here's our new standard and folks aren't on board with it, that can be a challenge. So you want to make sure the OCM is involved. You want to make sure that the key stakeholders are involved that we talked about earlier. If you're not sure of what is a standard or where should I start with that, think back to the 80-20 rule, 80% of what you have, and think about what can someone request from the portal. Sometimes this is we already have a laptop request on the portal. So we can actually start with that and tie that into the asset management process. Use what you might already have out there or create that standard if you don't. Keep the scope limited. So I know I kind of keep mentioning this, but be realistic with what is possible in a certain timeline based on what you've heard from your organizational change planning, what you know about the groups. Really consider those pilot groups. This works very well. Not only does it get a quick win for a group who can then sort of fly the ServiceNow flag and be on board with future changes. They can be your group that you always go to work with and enhancements and changes. They love it. You love it. But it really helps with also collecting that critical feedback. You don't want to do the big bang approach and here's everything and you're starting collecting feedback because you didn't spend enough time on testing or training. And this is a good way to approach that. And also consider the certain types of assets. So I mentioned the existing catalog items you might have out there. Or it all ties back to the 80-20 rule, really. We have laptops, we have devices that we need that are used very frequently, requested during onboarding. Start with those. Know when to keep existing processes. You don't want to try to replace everything from the get-go. I mentioned that maybe there's a complex system over here and we can really replace the 70% of the process, make that much better. And then the 30%, the 20% could be over here with sort of a manual link between the two. That's okay. One example from a past conversation has been this client used PeopleSoft to track assets, and the group, really their facilities group and other people looking at asset information in PeopleSoft, the financial aspects about it, that could not change. But we didn't let that stop us from starting the transformation process. So beginning with asset management, how do we start with the procurement side, or users requesting items from the catalog? Software too. I know we're talking a little bit more about hardware, but software is in the same respect. How do we start that request process? How can we standardize what's the software we give out, what's the hardware we give out? And then in this case, it made sense to do an integration with PeopleSoft and have ServiceNow as the source of truth and update PeopleSoft when it made sense. That was more of a day 2 item. Day 1 was let's standardize as much of that process as we can and then do that integration in the future. But in their case, PeopleSoft wasn't going away. It's not going to. So that should be part of your planning. How to begin with software. Software is always a fun conversation. Software is, a lot of times, nobody knows what's installed where. If you have discovery and you're collecting some of that information, good. Sometimes there's a lack of understanding of entitlements. Yeah, we have 30,000 people, we have 3,000 people using this software. How many licenses do we have for that? Not sure. And maybe it's a true up model, so we don't really know until we get the bill. Software asset management journeys tend to be a little bit longer in terms of collecting all that information, knowing the entitlements, knowing what you have today. But a very, very easy way to start is SaaS licensing. So if you haven't looked at ServiceNow's SaaS licensing module, I'd recommend you do. Again, there's plenty of demos, videos out there. Feel free to contact us if you want a demo or an understanding of it. This is a very low lift because there are tons of out-of-the-box tie-ins to cloud software, to SaaS software, Microsoft Office, maybe Salesforce licensing, whatever that system is. ServiceNow can track, here's not only the licensing that you have and the cost you're paying for, but off the bat, we can get usage details. This person hasn't logged in the last 30 days. Do they still need it? Let's start a process to potentially reclaim that license. SaaS is a very low lift from a licensing perspective that you should highly consider. Just because a software asset management, more traditional side is more the box software and is usually just more process around that, but SaaS licensing, very easy to get started. When you're going through this process, when you're thinking about how to begin, consider your current policies. So things like your acquisition process, deployment, inventory, how you handle contracts, how you handle retirement, disposal, and always have that consideration of how does ServiceNow handle that? ServiceNow has those pre-built workflows for best practice. This is how you should do it. If you're not doing standard requests yet, or if you're not keeping stockroom information up to date, there's some opportunities to improve right away there. Or if we have a great way to handle contracts. We have a document repository that we use. There's other ways to use contract management by getting that key information into ServiceNow, into your single source of truth. And then, keep the document wherever you want, but it's more of extrapolating that information and having it tied to notifications, automation. How can we know when the maintenance contract is expiring? I did think it would be useful to show a example process from an actual client that we recently worked with of what their day 1 looked like. So the main folks involved were kind of making a request for an asset, the asset manager or the facilities team in their case. And this was, the process can start from two ways. One, I can make a request from an asset from the catalog, and it follows the process to go to the asset manager to deliver that or work with facilities. The asset manager did the configuration, facilities was delivering the asset to the user. But something I want to call out is, again, the order assets from the vendor. They wanted to integrate and tie in with, I believe it was CDW, to automatically handle an order, but based on a understanding of their process today and the folks involved and the systems involved, it would have delayed the project. There's a lot that was involved in making that change. The integration, that's always the easy part, the technical integration. It's more the what does it affect from the process side. So their day one, it made sense to say, hey, that order process still happens outside. And in their case, they actually had a spreadsheet that they would get that has, here's everything that's ordered. So instead of starting the process in ServiceNow, we were uploading the spreadsheet to automatically create the procurement entries and handle everything that ServiceNow does very well for the asset process. So you have options there. You don't have to look at ServiceNow and say, oh, it's too much to take on right now. This will be too much change. That there's ways to get around that, ways to still make improvements. Part of this process is also asking yourself, what's working well? What needs to be improved? Some examples are, maybe we do great with receiving today. We put the barcodes on, we have a scanning process. We know what our asset models are. Maybe things that need to be improved are, we have too many tools, we can't find information. Users don't have self-service for ordering devices, keeping track of devices. Ordering from vendors is difficult. So this is always different company by company, but start to ask yourself this, and this all goes part of the planning process, all goes to what makes sense for day one, what's a good thing for day two. So far, this has been a lot of the organizational change around this, or what to consider, how to approach a project like this or an implementation like this. But how this might actually look from a roadmap perspective, I want to give you an idea of some of typical recommendations, what we typically do, what you might want to consider. So a usual phased approach for a program like this, I keep mentioning the crawl, the walk, the run. So in this case, it may be starting with the CMDB. Let's populate everything you have out there. Let's populate your assets and let's define those standards. Let's start the procurement inventory process. Let's get that foundation in place. For a lot of customers, maybe starting with the CMDB, starting with loading in assets, that's something we might want to hold off on. This definitely varies based on companies, but a typical approach could be that. And then usually it's more on the SaaS, software asset management. Maybe software asset management on day one, we want visibility into usage. That's what we're going to focus on. Want to start keeping track of contracts. And now we're going to do an integration to place an order with the vendor or with our ERP system. And then more of a run phase might be let's enhance software asset management. And before it was really just about getting visibility into usage, what's out there, cost. But now we want to automate access provisioning, or let's do automatic reclamations, really growing into the potential automations there. Track vendors a bit more. The journey is really visibility, understanding to help you make decisions. And then how can we help automate those to help you make those decisions faster or give you as much information as possible. So a lot of times the vendor management piece, who you work with and who you order from, but if you have an option to order from CDW or Apple directly or Dell directly, who should you leverage based on not only the costs, but send surveys out to users? What's your interaction like when you have to deal with support, when you have to deal with sales? All that goes into the process. So on the how to begin, I mentioned, maybe more of a minimum viable product. Start with the pilot group, start with a small number of product models. Something I'd recommend you avoid for day one is importing current data. So if you're manually saying, I need to track all the contracts I have out there, I need to track all the assets, and you're not doing it from an automated import of Discovery or SCCM or Jamf or something like that. Start with, if there's some contracts that are very important, 5 or 10, let's get those in there. But don't load data just for the sake of loading data. Avoid complex integrations, global rollouts, or large geography, unless it's a kind of a smaller rollout, but the organizational change really comes into play there. So things to consider, and really things that we typically recommending avoiding if possible on day one. So I know we're coming up to time. So if you want to grab your mobile phones in just a minute, we'll get back to Kahoot. Just ask sort of a quick wrap up question, and we'll get to wrapping up here. If you logged out of Kahoot, I'll pull up the code again so you have it. And yeah, from a takeaway perspective, really looking at, asset management is critical for controlling spend and influencing purchasing decisions. We hope we really understand that and can see how you can start on that journey. Getting started is easier than you think. I hope based on today, you can see some options or some paths of, we can't replace this, or we can't start here, but SaaS licensing, that could be an easy start. Or let's start with tracking our laptops for now. That's our biggest pain point. There's a lot of choices there. And start small, grow your strategy over time. So we will jump into Kahoot for the last question. So once again, if you logged out, the code will be at the bottom here, 563-7120. What's a key takeaway that you have? Is it what's on there? Do you have other ones? About 15 seconds left. Okay, got a few answers coming in. Key takeaway, 80-20 rule, contracts, process, and start small. All good takeaways. So thank you everyone for participating in the Kahoot. I will jump back to PowerPoint here, and I'll pause. Nate or Dave, were there any other questions that came in? I saw a few were answered in the chat. Any questions? If not, I'll pass it over to Nate to wrap up.